The ink was not yet dry on the piece, and the man who had paid for it more dearly than any king in that hall stood 3 feet from the table and did not move. I was his officer. I had put him there myself, Sergeant Anselm Rowe, of the Valish Honor Watch, the single soldier chosen to stand at the head of the signing table while 2 crowns ended 11 years of war. I had chosen him because he was the steadiest man I commanded, and because, God help me, I did not know on the morning I named him that the war we were burying had taken his brother and 4 men of his own section into ground that would never be ours again. He had not told me. A sergeant does not bring his grief to a parade. He brought his bearing instead, and his bearing was perfect, and I have spent the years since trying to explain to younger men what perfect cost him that day. Let me tell it the way it happened, because the way it happened is the only thing that does it justice. The treaty was signed on the island of Graymere, in the Hall of the Long Water, a low gray building of sea stone set on neutral ground in the strait, chosen because it belonged to neither the Crown of Vale nor the Margravate of Corinth, the 2 powers who had bled each other white across the reach for 11 years. Neither side would sign on the other's soil. So they met on a rock between, in a hall that smelled of salt and old smoke, with the water moving gray under the high windows and the whole strait visible beyond. The same water that had carried our dead home and theirs, the same gray that had swallowed both fleets in the bad winter. I will tell you what 11 years means so you understand the room. It means a generation. It means boys who enlisted at the start were gray at the temples by the end if they lasted. It means that nearly every man and woman in that hall, Valish and Cornish both, had buried someone. The peace was not a triumph. No one cheered. The 2 delegations came in along opposite walls and would not look at each other, because looking meant remembering, and remembering in that hall was a kind of wound. I had brought 12 men of the honor watch for the standing. 11 of them lined the walls. The 12th was Rowe, and Rowe stood alone at the head of the table where the 2 instruments of peace lay open on green cloth, a candle and a sandshaker and 2 pens between them, waiting. I want to be precise about where he stood, because everything that mattered that day happened in the space he did not cross. He stood at the high end of the table, behind and between the 2 empty signing chairs, at honor, boots together, rifle grounded, white-gloved hands crossed on the muzzle rest, bearskin squared, chin level, eyes forward over the heads of both delegations to the gray window and the gray water beyond. He was the still point the whole room would turn around. That is what an honor guard is. He is the fixed thing that says, this is solemn, this is weighed, this is being done properly in front of witnesses by people who understand what it costs. He took his post 40 minutes before the doors opened. I checked him myself, a habit nothing more walked the line came to him last, and it was at him that I stopped because something in his face was wrong, not slack. Rowe was never slack, it was the opposite, it was too still. A man holds his face still on parade, yes, but there is always a little life under it, a little weather. Under Rowe's face that morning there was no weather at all. It was the stillness of a man holding something very heavy and very level, the way you carry a full cup across a long room without spilling, every muscle bent to not moving. "Sergeant," I said low, "you're well." "Fit for duty, sir," he said. His eyes did not leave the window. I almost left it there. I wish, sometimes, that I had let him keep his grief private, the way he plainly wanted to. But I had served beside Anselm Rowe for 6 years, and I knew the difference between a man at rest and a man holding a cup, and I asked him the second question, the one that opened the day. "Rowe, is there a reason you shouldn't stand this one? Speak plain. I'll change the detail and no man will think the worse of you." For a long moment he said nothing, and the water moved in the window, and somewhere out in the strait a bell buoy rang slow over the swell. "My brother went down at the reach, sir," he said at last, "Tobias. And 4 of my section with him, Pell, Dunmore, Harrow, and young Carrow, who was 16 and lied about it to come. This treaty," and here his voice did not break, which was worse than if it had, "this treaty draws the line a half-mile north of the ground they're buried in. So when they sign it, sir, my brother stays in Korish earth. Forever, that's the peace. He drew one slow breath. And I would like to stand it, sir, if you'll let me. I would rather be the one standing than be anywhere else on this earth while it's signed. I have given a great many orders in my life. I have never had to think harder about one word. Because the right answer by the book was to pull him, a grieving man has no business at the still point of a state ceremony, where one cracked face becomes the story instead of the piece. That was the safe order. That was the order the manual would have given. But I looked at his face, holding its terrible level, and I understood something I have never been able to unlearn since. I understood that there was no man in that hall, not the king, not the margrave, not one diplomat who had spent 11 years drawing lines on maps, who had more right to stand at the head of that table than the man whose brother the lines had cost. The peace did not belong to the men who wrote it. It belonged to the men who had paid for it. And here was one of them, asking only to be allowed to stand still while the bill came due. "You'll stand it, Sergeant," I said. "Stand it for all of them." "Sir," he said. That was all. But something in the level of his face changed by a hair, not eased, but accepted, the way a man settles a weight more squarely on his back before a long carry. I stepped back into my place by the wall and the great doors opened, and the two delegations came in, and the war began to end. They came in slowly, because nothing about that day was quick. The crown of Vale entered from the eastern door, the king, gray-bearded, walking with the heaviness of a man who has signed too many letters to too many mothers. Behind him his chancellor, his lord of the reach, his clerks with their leather cases. From the western door came the margravate of Corinth, the old margrave himself, smaller than I had imagined, with a face like a closed fist and eyes that missed nothing. His marshal, a tall, scarred soldier named Vec who had commanded against us at the Reach and elsewhere, their own clerks and lords. The two parties took the two long sides of the table and stood, and for a moment no one sat because to sit first was to seem eager, and no one in that hall was eager. They were only tired and bound by the thing they had come to do. And in the center of it all, at the head, between the empty chairs, stood my sergeant. He did not look at the king. He did not look at the margrave. He looked over them at the gray water holding his cup. The first hour was reading. There is always reading. A clerk of Vale read the articles aloud in our tongue, and a clerk of Corinth read them again in theirs, and a third man, a neutral of Graemere, read them a third time in the old straight speech that both sides could follow, so that no man could later claim he had signed a thing he did not understand. Article by article the war was dismantled, the cessation of arms, the exchange of prisoners, the return of the taken towns, and then I felt the room go tight when it came the article of the line. The new border, drawn down the spine of the Reach, a half-mile north of a hill that had no name on the map but had a name in my sergeant's mouth, because his brother was buried on the wrong side of it. I did not look at Rowe when the clerk read the line. I made myself not look. To look would have drawn every eye in the room to him, and I would not do that to him. But I heard the clerk's voice say the names of the rivers and the ridge, and I knew that Rowe was hearing his brother's grave assigned in law forever to the country we had fought, and I knew he was standing perfectly still while it happened, and I have never in my life been prouder of a man and sorrier for him in the same breath. It was during the second reading that the trouble came. It came, as trouble in such rooms usually does, not from the great men but from a small one. There was a young lord in the Korish party, a nephew of the Margraves by the look of the resemblance, sleek and bored and too young to have lost anything real to the war, the kind of man who measures a piece by whether it flatters him. He had been fidgeting through the reading, and at some point his eye fell on my sergeant standing at the head of the table, and a peace ceremony being a tedious thing to a man with no dead, he decided to be amusing. He leaned to the Korish marshal and said, not quite quietly enough, in our tongue, he wanted it understood, "Do the Valish keep a statue at the table now? Or does that one only stand because they cannot afford a real soldier to sit?" A few of his own people did not laugh. The Marshal, Vec, did not laugh. I saw the old soldier's jaw set. But a hall holds its breath at a wrong note, and the wrong note hung there, and the young lord, encouraged by the silence the way fools always are, pushed it further. He rose halfway from the table, made a little show of peering at Roe as one peers at a waxwork, and said, "Does it move? Vale, does your honor guard move, or is it only painted on?" Now understand what he was doing, because it is the oldest provocation in the world dressed in court clothes. He could not insult the king to his face. He could not insult the Margrave, his own uncle. So he reached for the one man in the room who, by every rule of his office, could not answer back, the still soldier at the table, and he tried to make a toy of him to amuse a room that was too sad to amuse. It is a small cruelty. But small cruelties, in a hall where a generation's grief is being signed away, land like cannon. I felt my own hand close at my side. By the wall, two of my honor watch shifted their weight a quarter-inch. I stilled them with my eyes. This was not ours to answer. If a Valish officer crossed that floor to defend his man, the story of the day would become a brawl between delegations, and the peace would limp out of that hall wounded. The young lord, whether he knew it or not, had just made my sergeant the most important man in the room. Everything now turned on whether a grieving soldier could outdiscipline a fool. Roe did not move. He did not move the way a statue does not move, which is to say without effort, dead stone. He held still the way a living man holds still under a great strain, and that is a different stillness entirely, and every soul in that hall could feel the difference, though not one of them could have named it. His chin stayed level. His eyes stayed on the gray window. His white-gloved hands stayed crossed on the muzzle rest, and not one finger tightened. The bored young lord, peering at him, expecting to see the flicker that would let him laugh, found nothing to laugh at. There is no joke in a man who will not be moved. The joke needs the flinch. Roe gave him no flinch, and so the young lord's little performance simply died in the air, unfunny, leaving only the cruelty bare, with the whole room looking at it. And then the old Margrave turned his head. He had not turned it once in the hour and more since he sat. He had watched the table, the papers, his closed fist of a face giving nothing. Now he turned it slowly and looked first at his nephew, who was still half risen, smirking at the soldier. And then he looked at the soldier. And then he did a thing I did not expect, and that I have thought about every day since. He looked at the soldier for a long time. Long enough that the nephew's smirk faltered and the young lord sat back down. The Margrave studied Roe's face, the level chin, the steady eyes, the stillness that was so plainly costing the man something, and I watched the old enemy of my country read, in my sergeant's bearing, a thing he recognized. Because the Margrave had buried men too. 11 years buries men on both sides of every line, and a man who has buried his own can tell, across a room, across a border, across a language, the look of another man holding a grief level so it will not spill in front of strangers. The Margrave did not speak to his nephew. He did not need to. He simply turned back to the table, and in the turning, without a word, he made it known to his entire party that the soldier at the head of the table was not to be played with, that the still Valish guard had earned, in those few held seconds, a respect the young lord had just thrown away. The nephew's face went from bored to uncertain to, at last, ashamed, which was more than I had hoped a fool could manage. And the reading went on, and the hall was tighter now, and more solemn, because something true had passed through it. I thought that was the moment. I thought the day's lesson had been spent. I did not yet know that my sergeant had not yet begun to pay what he had come to pay. The third reading ended near noon. The light through the high windows had gone from the flat gray of morning to a paler gray with a little silver in it, the kind of light the straight gives when the cloud thins but will not break. The neutral clerk of Graymere set down the straight speech copy, and a silence came over the hall that was different from all the silences before it, the silence before a thing that cannot be taken back. The King of Vale rose. He came to the head of the table, to the chair on the eastern side, and he stood behind it with his hand on its back. Across from him, the old Margrave rose and came to the western chair. The two of them faced each other over the open instrument, with my sergeant standing between and behind, the still point, the witness, and for a moment neither king nor Margrave sat. They only looked at each other, two old men who had spent their reigns sending other men's sons against each other, and now had to do the harder thing, which was to stop. It was the king who broke it. He did not sit. He stood with his hand on the chair, and he looked down at the article of the line, the half-mile, the ridge, the unnamed hill, and I saw him hesitate. I knew that hesitation. It was the same one that had been moving like a current under the whole ceremony, the question no treaty can answer. Was it worth it? All of it, all 11 years, every name on every letter, and at the end a line on a map a half-mile off from where it might have been, and the dead on both sides of it staying dead. A king is not allowed to ask that question out loud, but he can stand a moment too long over a pen, and every man who has lost someone will know what he is doing. And it was in that hesitation, the king's hand on the chair, the pen untouched, the whole hall holding its breath, that my sergeant, for the first time in 3 hours, moved. It was the smallest movement a man can make. I doubt half the hall saw it. But I saw it, because I had been watching him the way you watch a man carrying a full cup across a long room. Sergeant Anselm Rowe, who had stood at honor while his brother's grave was assigned forever to the enemy, who had stood while a fool tried to make a toy of him, who had not so much as tightened a glove in 3 hours, my sergeant slowly, deliberately, drew himself up a half-inch taller. He squared his shoulders that last fraction. He brought his chin, already level, up to the fullest height a man can give a thing, and he fixed his eyes not on the gray window now, but down at the open treaty on the green cloth, at the line that kept his brother in Cornish ground, and he held himself over that line, at the most perfect honor I have ever seen a soldier render. He was not protesting, understand that. There was no defiance in it, no reproach, nothing a single soul could have called out of order. He was doing the opposite of protest. He was telling the king, telling the whole hall, in the only language his office permitted him, the language of bearing, that the peace was worth the price, that his brother in the enemy's earth was a price worth paying for the end of the killing. That a soldier who had every reason to wish the pen would falter was instead, with every inch of himself, honoring the signing of it. I have tried for years to put into words what that did to the room. The best I can do is this. A grieving man giving his blessing to the thing that grieved him is the most powerful argument there is, and it needs no words at all. The king saw it. He had been hesitating over the pen, and he looked up, perhaps to steady himself, perhaps only to rest his eyes a moment off the cruel small print of the line, and he looked up into the face of the soldier standing honor over it. He saw the level chin. He saw the eyes fixed down on the line in perfect honor. And being a man who had spent 11 years learning to read soldiers' faces, he understood at once what he was looking at. A man who had lost a brother to that very border, standing at attention to honor the peace that fixed it there. A man telling him without a word, sign it. It is worth it. We paid, and it is worth it. The king's hesitation left him. I watched it go out of him like water out of a tilted glass. He drew the chair back and sat, and he took up the pen, and his hand, which had wavered a moment before, was steady now, because a king who is wavering will find his courage in a soldier who is not. He dipped the pen. He signed the crown of Vale to the piece, his name long and slow across the bottom of the instrument, and the candle threw his shadow up the wall, and the sandshaker hissed across the wet ink, and across the strait the bell buoy rang. Then he did a thing no article of the treaty required. He did not pass the pen straight to the Margrave. He held it a moment, and he looked up again at my sergeant, who had returned now to his level forward gaze, the honor rendered, the cup still held, and the King of Vale, in front of both delegations, inclined his head to the soldier at the head of his own table. A small bow, a king to a sergeant. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. But every man in that hall saw it, and every man understood it, because the king had said with that small bow what he could not say in any article, that the peace he had just signed belonged not to him, but to the men who had bought it, and that one of them was standing right there, and the king would not sign over their heads without acknowledging it. Roe did not look at the king. He could not at honor. But I saw the muscle move at the corner of his jaw, the only sign in 3 hours that the man inside the soldier was still alive in there, holding the cup, and that the king's bow had reached him. The Margrave had watched all of it. He had watched the soldier draw himself up over the line. He had watched the king hesitate and find his courage in a sergeant's bearing. He had watched a king bow to a soldier of his own. And the old enemy of my country sat very still in his western chair, and I saw him look once more at the Valish guard, the man his nephew had tried to make a toy of, and I saw something settle in that closed-fist face that I can only call decision. He took up his own pen, but he did not sign at once either. Instead, the old Margrave of Corinth did something that broke the order of the ceremony, and that no one had planned, and that I will carry to my own grave as the finest act I ever saw a man on the other side of a war perform. He set the pen down again. He turned to his marshal, to Vec, the scarred soldier who had commanded against us at the Reach, and he spoke to him low in their own tongue, a few words I could not follow. The hall stiffened. An unplanned pause in a signing is a frightening thing because it can mean a man is about to refuse. The Valish clerks went rigid. I saw the king's hand tighten on the table, but the Margrave's face was not the face of a man refusing. It was the face of a man who had decided to do a hard right thing while he still had the chance. The Marshal Vec rose. He came around the western side of the table, and he came toward my sergeant. By the wall, every man of my honor watch went tight as a drawn wire, and I felt my own pulse in my throat, because here was the enemy's senior soldier walking up to my still man with the whole piece hanging by a thread, and I did not know what he meant by it. Vec stopped before Roe. He stood close enough that the two soldiers, the Valish and the Chorish, were near eye to eye, the enemy commander and the brother of the men that commander's army had killed. And the Marshal Vec in our tongue, so that the whole hall would hear and understand, said, "Sergeant, I commanded at the Reach." Roe did not move. He could not. He held his level forward gaze over the marshal's shoulder, the cup unspilled, but I saw him hear it. "I do not know your name," Vec went on, "but I know your bearing, and I have buried enough of my own to know what it costs you to stand here today. Some of my men lie in that ground too. The line your king and my Margrave are drawing keeps my dead on your side of it as it keeps yours on mine. We are the two of us the same kind of poor." He paused. The hall did not breathe. "I came across this table to tell you, soldier to soldier in front of both our crowns, the men we leave in the wrong earth are not abandoned. They are honored. By me, by mine, as I trust ours are honored by you. That is the peace I am about to sign, not a line. A promise that no man on the far side of it lies forgotten." It was the most extraordinary thing. A war is two countries each believing the other's dead are nothing. And here was the enemy's own marshal crossing the floor of the treaty hall to swear, to the brother of the men he had fought, that our dead in his ground would be tended as his own. He could have signed in silence and let the dead lie unspoken of. No article required this. He did it because he had looked at my sergeant standing honor over the line that kept his brother in Chorish earth, and he had understood that a peace which did not honor the dead of both sides would not hold, that a treaty is only paper, and the thing that makes paper into peace is exactly this: two soldiers agreeing across a border that the other's dead are worth tending. Then the Marshal Vec did the last thing. He drew himself up, and he rendered my sergeant a full Chorish salute, the enemy's salute given by the enemy's commander to a Valish guard at a treaty table. Hand to brow, slow and deliberate, the whole hall watching. I have given orders all my life, and I had no order for this. There is nothing in any manual about what a Valish honor guard does when the enemy's marshal salutes him. By the strictest letter, Roe was to stand at honor and acknowledge nothing. The still point acknowledges no one, that is its discipline. And for one held second, Roe held to it. He did not move. Then he chose. I watched him choose. It was not a break in discipline, it was the highest use of it. Sergeant Anselm Roe brought his right hand off the muzzle rest, and he returned the Marshal Vex salute, Valish soldier to Cornish soldier, the brother of the dead to the commander who had killed them, and he held it, hand to Bearskin's brow, level and exact, and the two old enemies stood there saluting each other across the unsigned peace. And only then, with his hand at the salute, did Roe's eyes leave the far window. They came down and they met the marshal's. And whatever passed between those two soldiers in that look, two men who had spent 11 years trying to put each other in the ground, now standing as the only two men in the hall who fully understood what the ground had taken, whatever passed between them, it was the truest thing in the room, truer than any article, and the whole hall felt it land. I looked once at the great men. The King of Vale had risen halfway from his chair without knowing it. The young Cornish lord who had tried to make a toy of my sergeant had his hand over his mouth. And the old Margrave, who had sent his marshal across that floor, was watching the two soldiers salute with the closed fist of his face finally open. An old man looking at the only kind of peace that ever holds, the kind soldiers make with each other when the kings have run out of words. The salutes came down together. The Marshal Vec inclined his head a last fraction, turned and walked back to the western side, and resumed his place behind his Margrave, and the hall let out a breath it had held for a very long time. The old Margrave took up his pen. He looked at the soldier one last time. And he signed the Margravate of Corinth to the peace, his name beneath the king's, the candle throwing both their shadows up the gray stone, the sand hissing across the second wet signature, the bell buoy ringing slow out in the strait, and the war that had lasted 11 years and taken a generation from both sides of the water was, at that ringing, over. No one cheered. I told you no one would, and no one did. It was too dearly bought for cheering. But a thing happened in that hall instead of a cheer that I think was finer than any cheer could have been. The two delegations, who had come in along opposite walls and would not look at each other, now, in the silence after the second signature, began slowly, awkwardly, like men relearning a thing they had forgotten how to do, to look at each other. A Valish lord met a Cornish clerk's eye and did not look away. The two marshal's aides, who had been ready an hour before to hate, found they had nothing left to hate with. And the whole hall, Valish and Cornish together, turned, almost as one, toward the head of the table, toward the still soldier who had stood through all of it, who had honored the line that cost him his brother, who had saluted the man who killed him, and who now stood once more at level forward honor as though he had never moved at all. The ceremony was not quite finished. There were the copies to seal, the clerks to do their work, the formal withdrawal of the two crowns. An honor guard stands until he is stood down, and Roe stood. He stood while the wax was poured and the seals pressed, while the great men spoke their first careful courtesies across a table they could now both touch, while the light through the high windows slid from silver toward the gold of late afternoon. He had been at honor for the better part of 6 hours, and the cup he carried had not lightened. If anything, it had grown heavier, because the thing he had braced himself against all morning was now done, irreversible, signed in 2 hands and sealed in wax, and there is a particular weight that comes down on a man only after the dreaded thing is finally true. I gave the order at last. Honor watch, stand down. My 11 by the wall came to the rest, and Roe at the head of the table brought his rifle up, completed the movement of stand down precisely as the manual gives it, and for the first time in 6 hours was permitted to be, simply, a man. He did not weep. I want that understood, because in the years since I have heard the day retold by men who were not there, and in their telling Roe breaks down at the table and the kings comfort him, and it is all very moving and none of it is true. Anselm Roe did not break down. He had carried the cup across the whole long room of that day, and he did not spill it at the end. What he did was finer and quieter than any breaking down. When the stand-down was given and he was a man again, he stood for one moment at ease at the head of the table, and he let his eyes go, just once, to the gray window and the strait beyond, north, toward the unnamed hill that was now and forever Cornish ground, where his brother and Pell and Dunmore and Harrow and young Carow, who had lied about his age, all lay. He looked north for the length of one slow breath, and then he turned, squared himself, and marched off the floor to join his section by the wall, dry-eyed, level, and finished, having given the dead the only thing he had left to give them, which was a piece he had stood honor over so that no man could ever say it was bought cheap. It was the king who came to him. I did not expect it. The crowns withdraw first, by all custom the soldiers wait. But the king of Vale, before he withdrew, crossed the emptying hall to where my sergeant stood at the wall, and the king stopped before him, and Rowe came to attention. "Sergeant," the king said, "I am told since the signing what I did not know during it, that you lost a brother to that line. And 4 of your own besides." He paused, an old man choosing words. "I signed that line, I will carry that, but I want you to know what your standing did, because you may not know it, and a man should know what he has done." He glanced back at the table, at the sealed piece, at the place where the Margrave's marshal had saluted. "You made it real. The paper would have been only paper. You made it weigh what it should weigh." When I hesitated, and I did hesitate, Sergeant, you saw it, it was your bearing that steadied my hand. A king who wavers can find his courage in a soldier who does not. You gave me yours. I will not forget it, and Vale will not forget it. "Sir," said Rowe, it was all he ever said. But I saw the king understand, as I had understood that morning, that "sir," from a man like Anselm Rowe, holds more than other men put into 1,000 words. The king did not stop there. He had one more thing, and it was the thing that undid me, who had held my own composure all that long day. "The line keeps your brother in Corinth's earth," the king said. "That cannot be changed. A peace unmade to move a grave is no peace. But the Margrave has sworn, soldier to soldier, that our dead in his ground will be honored as his own. You heard it. The whole hall heard it. And I will hold him to it. Every year on this day, a party of Vale will be permitted across the new line to the hill where your brother lies, to tend it and to stand honor over it. It is written into the peace as I left the hall. I added it with my own hand before the seal was poured. Your standing put it there, Sergeant. The first man to stand that honor on that hill next year will be you, if you will have it, with my leave and the Margrave's safe conduct." I watched my sergeant receive that, and the level he had held all day held still, but his eyes, which had been dry through the signing and dry through the salute and dry through the long stand-down, filled at last, there at the wall where no delegation could see, with only his king and his officer to know it. He did not let them fall. He blinked once hard and brought them level, and he said, "I'll have it, sir. Thank you, sir." And the king inclined his head to him a second time that day and withdrew. We sailed back across the strait that evening into a sunset that had finally broken through the gray, the water running gold under the boat, the hall of the long water shrinking behind us on its rock. My men were quiet. It had been a long day and a heavy one, and there was nothing to say that the day had not already said better. I found Rowe at the stern, looking back north, and I went and stood beside him, officer and sergeant, the way we had stood beside each other for 6 years. "You did a hard thing today, Anselm," I said. "I do not often use a man's given name. I used his." He was quiet a while. The gold light was on the water and on his tired face. "I keep thinking," he said at last, "that Tobias would have wanted me to stand it. He was a better soldier than me. He'd have said, 'Stand it straight, Anselm, don't let them sign it sloppy,' so I stood it straight." He let a breath go. "It's the last order I'll ever get from my brother, sir, to stand still while they end the war that took him, and I stood it." He turned from the rail, and the level was back, but it was a lighter level now, a man who had carried the cup the whole way and set it down at last without spilling a drop. "That's the peace, sir. That's the whole of it. We stand still while they end it, and we don't let them end it cheap. That's the only thing a soldier can give a war once it's over. I have commanded many men. I have stood at many ceremonies since, and I will stand it more before they retire me. But I have never seen, and I do not expect to see again, a finer thing than a grieving man standing perfectly still to honor the peace that grieved him, asking nothing, sparing himself nothing, giving the dead the only gift he had left. People speak of that day as the day two kings made peace. They are wrong, or they are only half right. The kings made the paper. The peace, the real peace, the kind that holds, the kind both nations have kept now for all the years since, the peace was made at the head of that table by a sergeant who lost his brother to the line and stood honor over it anyway, dry-eyed and level, so that an enemy marshal crossed the floor to salute him and a king bowed his head and a fool learned shame. The peace was made by a man who did not move. He paid for it more dearly than any crown in that hall, and he stood still, and that standing still was the most that any soldier has ever given to the ending of a war. He stood the honor on the hill the next year, as the king promised, with the Margrave's safe conduct, the first Valish guard to cross the new line in peace. I am told he stood it the same way he stood the treaty, level, dry-eyed, perfect, giving the dead their due. I am told the Cornish honored their part and tend our ground still as we tend theirs. The line has not moved in all the years since. The peace has held. It has held because it was paid for properly, by a man who knew exactly what it cost, and stood still while it was bought.